Hey everybody, welcome back to another video in the No Code Academy, and this one I'm really excited for because Buildship V2 has landed. There's been a whole host of new features, upgrades, enhancements, whatever you want to call them, that will absolutely, I'm pretty confident, will level up your workflow creations. So what I've done is I put it through its paces, I've kind of got into the features, and in this video I'm going to walk you through quite a few of them actually, and I'm sure the team will carry on enhancing V2 from here onwards. So without further ado, let's get into the video and let's get cracking. Okay, so before we get started into the new features of Buildship V2, let's quickly explain what Buildship is. Now, just think of Buildship as a visual backend builder. It allows you to create kind of either simple or more complex workflows that your front-end application or your calling service can interact with. And of course, the logical workflows can do everything that they need to do. They can maybe call out to third-party services like ChatGPT or databases or whatever it needs to do. And then, of course, you can return back that data back to your calling application. So that's it in a nutshell. Let's get into the new features of Buildship V2. Okay, so here we are then in the brand new homepage of Buildship V2. Now, cosmetically, you look at this and think, oh, that's very similar. It is very similar to V1, but there is some key differences here with this brand new homepage. Here it's kind of giving this bit more front and center over the number of active flows that you have within inside your particular plan. Now, different plans have a different set of limits. This is the starter plan, so I've got 20 here, and it's saying I've got no flows, and of course I haven't got any flows that built in this particular project at the moment, but we'll touch on that shortly. Here is the storage, so it gives me a little bit more indicator of how much storage I'm using up and of course how many team members I can have in this particular plan. And this is quite a convenient little kind of a kickstart here to creating some specific types of flows, and of course no doubt they'll probably build out with more options on the homepage in due course. Now on the left hand side here you can see this is the same as what we had before, where all of our flows will be listed. You can see here I've got no number indicator to determine how many flows I can have in this particular project, and there's a reason for that, and I'll touch on that very shortly. Now down here we've got this kind of new credit indicator here. Again, I'll drill into that a little bit more, but other than that everything else is the same with this brand new homepage. Okay, clicking on the little plus button here to the top left reveals this particular page. Now I can create a brand new workflow at this particular point, or I can choose from a number of templates that's already been created. And of course, these are all going to build up over time, these particular templates. And of course, it looks pretty nice. We've got some kind of visual cues now, so things all look a little bit nicer than V1 here. But other than that, it's largely a nice selection of different templates that you can use in your particular project. I'm just going to quickly select one here. Let's see what that looks like within the kind of the design canvas. Now, instantly on the left-hand side, you're going to see that we've kind of got this kind of representation now. We've kind of got now readmes within inside our kind of our folders here. So this has created a new kind of a folder called AI Chatbot, and I've got this README which talks a little bit about how I can actually use this particular workflows. And the magical thing here, of course, is that you can now create these READMEs yourself to kind of associate with your workflows. Now that's going to be really great, because when you then are sharing these out with the community, or you just kind of want to keep notes against your workflows to kind of just put some documentation together, then of course you can associate that in here as well. Now going back to the actual workflow itself, now you can see here that I've now selected it. Now I've kind of got this all nicely centered on the screen, and things do look a little bit different now, and I'm going to touch on those very shortly. But instantly you can kind of see I've got these kind of sticky notes that's kind of now associated with workflows. Again, we'll touch on that very shortly, but generally I just want to point out that the experience that you're kind of seeing with inside the kind of the workflow canvas is very similar, but I'm going to kind of drill in specifically to the details as we work through this particular video. Okay, so here we are then in Buildship V1, and in the top left here you can see that it says 5 of 20. Now this is telling me that I've got 5 workflows in my project up to a limit of 20 that I've currently got on my particular plan. Now the problem with that, of course, is as soon as you are creating 20 workflows you can create no more. Well, the great thing though about Buildship V2 is that restriction has now gone, which is fantastic. It means yes, you can ship 20 workflows that can be running out in the wild, but you can carry on kind of building and prototyping and testing and carry on doing all this wonderful stuff with these additional workflows until you then decide to then push those out into the wild itself, into production. So that is one restriction that's now been lifted in Buildship V2. Okay, one nice thing about V2 that I really like is the fact is that if you are using BuildShip for the first time, you can kind of get yourself up to speed pretty quickly with using these new kind of walkthroughs here. So you can kind of just simply create a brand new workflow. You can hit this kind of do it for me, and it kind of will keep walking through all the various parts here of a BuildShip, which I think is a great little addition to the product. Okay, so in BuildShip V1, you could create notes against a particular workflow. You can kind of up there, select that little icon, you can kind of put some freeform text in there. But in V2, things have changed somewhat. You can now create these what looks like sticky notes to be then associated and packaged up with your actual workflows, and they can be added by simply clicking this little option up here. I can now hover over a particular region of the kind of the nodes on the workflow. I can just hit that, and now I've kind of got this little sticky note that has been sort of created for me. And of course I can just type in some details here, and I can then just select the little X here and close it down, and of course I can move these about anywhere I would like to kind of draw attention to that information. And of course I can associate some attachments or some sort of code and images and some videos with this as well. So that is a really handy little feature in BuildShip V2. Certainly if you're working in teams that are using kind of multiple teams working sort of using these sort of workflows. So and also as well, it's really useful as well that if you then come back to workflows in the future that you've been working on maybe 6 or 9 months ago, at least you can kind of remind yourself exactly the way that specific nodes are actually working. So that's a really smart feature in V2. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the new credit system with inside BuildShip, because that's been quite a fundamental change to how V1 works. So down the left-hand side here, I mentioned that there's this new credit indicator. Now, different plans have different number of credits that are associated with the plan. Now, this is the starter plan, and at the time of recording, there's 20,000 credits part of the starter plan. I can just click on that, and I can kind of get this kind of usage window that kind of pops up, which will give me an indicator to kind of how many credits each of my workflows are using up. Now, the key thing to think about here is, and what does kind of one credit kind of equate to? Well, one credit equals about 3 seconds of execution time with inside your workflows. Now, the way that you want to look at it is that certain nodes will take up credits, certain nodes will not take up credits. So if we're talking about kind of core, sort of more sort of workflowy kind of nodes like branch, in fact, let me just show you here. Let me just add a brand new node here. These sort of nodes here where it's just kind of like fundamental kind of decision making or looping or something like that with inside your workflow, they will not consume up any credits at all. But it's kind of nodes like your integration nodes, calling out to ChatGPT or doing database updates, all that kind of stuff, that will. So it's important that you kind of keep your integrations nicely tuned, certainly if you're working with databases and things like that, to make sure that there's less credits get taken up. So just bear that one in mind, that is kind of how it works. And the great thing about it is you can just click on this little option here, and it gives you a nice little kind of breakdown here to kind of the number of credits that your workflows are consuming. And of course, there's a good thing as well is that this kind of gives you maybe some projections there to kind of how your credits will be used up over a 30-day period. So that's it in a nutshell on using credits with inside a BuildShip V2. Okay, so the way that BuildShip V2 wants to kind of make you think is in the way of kind of you are building something, you are connecting it up, and then you are shipping it. So it's kind of build, connect, ship. Now that is kind of represented with inside the UI at the top right here, because this is kind of a little bit different from V1, where we've kind of got the build here, where we can see the canvas, where we're doing kind of all of our creation. And then of course we've got this option for connect. This is kind of where you then have an opportunity to kind of then hook up your workflow to various different ways of connecting it a bit. So this is kind of like the traditional V1 sort of triggers. So there's a kind of a whole dedicated screen here that you can now have, and you can select from. And then of course the option then is to ship it. Once kind of everything is all connected up, you are then shipping it. Now this is quite an important concept, because what we can now do in V2, which we couldn't do in V1, is we can have a number of different triggers for a specific workflow. So for example, you could have a REST API kind of trigger, but you can also have a number of different other triggers that can trigger the same workflow. Now that is something you couldn't do in V1. So that is a great feature, and we'll touch on that very shortly. Okay, so let's take now a closer look at some of the workflow features. So this is a brand new workflow. I've kind of created it from the template that's currently within inside BuildShip, but there's some key bits that I want to point out to you. So you can see here that this is a ChatGPT node. Okay, so it's a very, very simple one. It just calls out to ChatGPT, passes in some instructions and a prompt, and of course you get a response back. Now, with this particular one here, you can see that I've got this kind of like little indicator here, which is talking about the key. So in order for me to invoke invoke this third-party API, I'm going to need to send over an API key. So what I can now do is I can select this here and I can add a brand new key in. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep the title the same, and I'm just going to paste in here an OpenAI key that I've got, and I'm just going to save that. Now what's going to happen here is that there's going to be a kind of a type that's going to kind of be associated to this particular API key. Now what's really great about this is that I can carry on creating workflows or creating an additional node here that uses the ChatGPT, and it's then going to pick up that OpenAI key. So it's going to save you having to hook that up time and time again. So that's quite smart. And of course as well, some of the nodes here have now been collapsed here, so the additional details have now been collapsed, and of course I can adjust these if I need to. So I've kind of got a little bit of sort of canvas state back. So what I can now do with this particular workflow is that I would like to kind of hook this up to a REST kind of trigger. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to use some of the more clever features of BuildShip V2, where it will auto detect the kind of the request that I'm actually making into this particular workflow. And let me show you how that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move up to the connect option. I'm going to say, right, brand new workflow. I now want to hit this up as a REST API call. So I can just choose that. And of course, you can see here now that my trigger is kind of added here on the left-hand side. It's kind of gave me the kind of the endpoint kind of URL path, which I can use, of course. And what I can now do is I can now simply, it's going to be a post request. I'm going to pass in some data into it. And I could just hit connect. Now that's going to kind of do its thing. Now what I'm going to now get from a BuildShip, of course, is the workflow URL. So I can just copy this here. Now this is the really smart bit, right? Now I've not set up any kind of inputs. Now I'm only going to need to pass a prompt into this particular workflow. So I just copied the endpoint URL to the clipboard. I'm now just going to move over to Hopscotch, which is just kind of like an API tester that I use. I'm just going to paste that in here itself. So just paste that there like that. And then I'm just going to hit send. Now that's going to send that request to the actual trigger itself. I'm just going to move back over to BuildShip. I can hit this get data option, and that's going to kind of auto sense the kind of the document that I've kind of sent you. Because here I've got like a body here, and I've got the prompt, and I can just select that prompt here. I can update the inputs, and that input will automatically be created as a workflow input. So I don't need to define those myself. So you can imagine here that if you are working with a really, really complex kind of request that's coming into your workflows, you don't need to worry about kind of building out the workflow inputs. Now, what's really smart about this, if I go back to then the build option, you can now see that my input is now set here as the prompt. So I've kind of got that now available to me. So I simply just need to come into then this particular workflow. I can then just delete that out of there and then just go to the inputs here. In fact, it's even suggested for me there. You can just see that if I go back, it's suggested here the kind of the prompt input. So I can just select that and I can now pass that prompt into the workflow. And what's really smart about this as well is you can see here that I'm now only selecting a REST API call here. So that's kind of like one trigger. And of course I could go back to connect here, and here I can add in a further trigger if I wanted to. Of course, this could be any kind of workflow, any kind of BuildShip trigger for maybe another workflow. I mean, you name it. There's different options that's available for me here as well. I could just say email trigger here, and now that is all set up. Of course, I can now set that up in specifically. And if I move back to then the build, you can now see I've got two kind of triggers here that they now can invoke this particular workflow. So it's a very, very simple and easy representation there at the top. What's nice about it as well, things are a little bit more kind of truncated. We don't need to, there's not too much clutter that's going on with inside the canvas space, which is really, really smart. So of course, what's really nice about this as well, and this again is another real extension here to then the canvas, is the fact is I can come in here and I've got the inputs available to me, and I can carry on creating additional inputs manually if I wanted to. I could pass in another string, I could pass in a boolean, and of course I can give these then a kind of a meaningful name, and then of course then therefore they're available throughout the rest of my actual workflow. And of course I could delete these, or I could make adjustments to them and change their types and whether they're required or not, and all that kind of stuff right there. So it's really, really convenient to kind of have that with inside the actual workflow itself. So that's it. That's just a very, very quick walkthrough on applying triggers and kind of auto sensing those inputs is going to come into then your workflow. One additional new feature in V2 is that when we created this particular workflow, you can see that it's already automatically added an output node. And it's been quite clever about this because it's kind of looked at the previous node before and it's kind of set that up as the response data that's going to be returned back to your calling application. You can see here that it's selected last node here, and it's passed already in the travel guide, which is the name of this particular node, as its kind of response. So that's quite convenient. Now, of course, you can customize that as well. So if that's not what you want, you can then come in here. Of course, you can go to custom output, and then traditionally you can kind of come in here and then you can kind of do all the things that you would normally do here, delete out and sort of tailor the output response that you've got sort of coming back. So in this particular example, I'm just going to keep it to the last node because that is the one that I've got coming through. Okay, so let's have a look at the changes in the testing space in BuildShip V2. So I've just hit the test button up here. I've just fired a prompt at this particular workflow. I said my city plan is Sydney, Australia. Now, of course, that's my prompt input parameter. And there is the result that I've kind of got back from ChatGPT. And you can see here, I've got a list here of the recent executions. And of course, if I just run that again, if I just change this then to perhaps, London, then England, oh, spell England right, like that, and hit the test workflow. I'll let it do its thing. And there it is. I've kind of got my response back, and you can kind of see now that I've kind of got my recent executions list down there. Now, there's a couple of bits to draw your attention to in testing. We've kind of got this option here where we can test the overall workflow. So by choosing workflow at the top, or it's another convenient way, I can drill down into the specific nodes and I can kind of test them independently. Now, of course, I could come away here. I could click on this little play option here, and that takes me into the same panel directly into the node that I'm kind of interested in. So what I can also do here is, well, I can go back to then the workflow, and I've got this option to save as an example. So of course, if you are kind of testing these workflows out quite a bit and you want to make sure that you can kind of save some examples that you can keep retesting, you can do that here. So you can say save as example like that. It's kind of saving a bit of a kind of a template, I guess. And of course, what I can now do is I can kind of either kind of see those saved examples there. I can click on the examples option up here. And of course, I can then select the saved example like that. And of course, I can then just test the workflow again. So it's a really, really convenient little panel now that's becoming a lot more powerful in V2 than it was in V1. So I recommend just keep exploring this particular panel, and no doubt they'll build out this over time as well with more enhanced features. Okay, so let's have a look then at a few more V2 features. So I'm going to click on the connect option up here. I'm going to click on usage, and you can see now that I've got a bit of a code snippet that I can lift and maybe put into my application that I'm building outside of sort of BuildShip. And of course, this is showing you a JavaScript example, but I'm sure in the future they'll add different languages in here. So that is that. Let's move back over to build. Let's have a look at a more complex workflow. So the great thing about BuildShip V2 is you can now kind of zoom in and you can now zoom out of particular kind of workflows. Of course, if you are building something quite complex, that should be really, really handy for you to kind of sort of navigate and hold the space around. You can move around the canvas, which makes it much more in keeping with other types of applications that you would probably use on a day-to-day basis. Okay, a nifty little extra feature within BuildShip V2 is on a shipped workflow, they can be in a paused or an active state. So I can just toggle that on now, and that turns into then an active workflow. And then on the left hand side here, you can now see that I've kind of got like a little visual prompt now to confirm that that particular workflow is currently active. Now, going back to kind of what I said originally, if you've kind of got maybe 40 workflows, but you've only got a 20 kind of workflow plan, you can easily then see kind of which ones are kind of active and which ones are not within inside the left hand side panel. The one additional excellent feature that's been added to V2 is the ability to now set variables within inside your workflow. Hurrah, this is something that is really handy, because in the past when I've created workflows, I kind of had to create kind of almost custom nodes in order to be able to track values. So let me show you how this works. Really straightforward. We can hit the little plus. There's this new flow node here called set variable. The good thing about this, of course, it doesn't use any credits. Now this is provided the node on the canvas here. Now I can just select the little drop down. I can add a variable. So let's create one called, say, maybe is active, like that. Just set the type here to the boolean like that, hit save. And of course I can come along here. I can then add a further variable in, for example. I could just call this one maybe name, like that, hit save. Now of course this specific node of course allows you to set the values then independently on these. So for example, I could choose is active, go to the value here, of course it will be JavaScript, so I'm just going to set this then to true like that. So that's gave it its value like that. And of course I could then add another node in here. I could then set variable. I could then come in here, let's just change this then to name and just call this one Steve like that. So that's available to me. So we're kind of setting variables as we go. Now how do you then use those variables? Well, it's really, really straightforward. build, because you can kind of come then into here, for example, and this won't obviously be valid, but what I can do is I could just come in here, select the variables there, and of course my local variables then have all of my values then available to me. So I can just choose name here, and of course if I set it up here, then the value is going to be available just down there. So that is a real time saver, and that's going to hopefully make your workflows feel much more logical and more obvious, and I'm sure that is going to be a very well received feature in V2. So I just want to draw your attention to a couple of areas that I want to point out in V2 with inside the project settings. You can see here this is going to look probably very similar to what you've seen in V1, but there are some changes. So with inside the integrations option here, you can see now I've got my keys listed, and of course I could just adjust these keys here, and of course any changes I make here, and those keys are therefore being used across your integrations, they'll all be updated together, so that's quite convenient. Now if I move up to, in fact I move down to monitoring, actually it's quite useful. A couple of little bits here, we can now get some email alerts here in terms of receiving the weekly usage report or daily error alert or anything like that. That's quite handy. If I move up to then the plan here, just a couple of bits to point out here. We've got some various options available here, and we obviously got some sort of some upgrades that we can have with inside our particular project down here, but this is quite good. Obviously it talks about your credit balance again. I know we see that just down here, but of course we can then kind of scale up and we can sort of buy additional credits if we need to in this particular panel. And of course we've got our transaction history that is kind of there. So just a couple of extra little features that we've got there, and of course, oh, in fact we've got the view usage as well. So that's just another way of just popping into that view usage screen. So what I really like about BuildShip is that you can get into some of these particular screens in different kind of areas of the product. So hopefully you won't sort of forget where they are across the board. So that's just a little bit on the project settings. Another feature I want to draw your attention to is you can now publish workflows to the community marketplace. Now that is a big thing, because of course if you can publish to the community marketplace, then other people can do that as well. So that's going to kind of build up the library of all of these types of workflows that no doubt you can then use with inside your own projects. Now to do that, it's quite simple. All you need to do is move over here to then the kind of, I kind of create a folder structure here. I kind of got like a README file in there with my workflow. I can hit on the little three dots here and I can say publish to the community. Now what's going to happen now is a little box is going to pop up. I need to fill in my profile details, and of course I can then go through the wizard. I can get that then published. So no doubt in the future it may be that there will be some more premium level kind of marketplace items that may have a cost associated with it. Otherwise there'll be a number of freely available marketplace items for you to kind of use in your own projects. So there you go. It's been an absolute pleasure to walk you through some of the fantastic features that have landed for BuildShip V2. The team are doing a fantastic job at BuildShip. I want to thank them for giving me the fantastic opportunity to kind of get into the product nice and early and have a good look around and put it through its paces. If you love BuildShip and if you love the no-code space, please do become a member of the Digital Pros and No Code Academy. The link is there on screen. And of course, if you want to keep it on YouTube, then please do subscribe and like as well. So hopefully I'll see you in the next video.